I started taking some folks from the Kansas City area down to Atlanta, Georgia to spend time with Bob Lupton probably 10 years ago. Bob Lupton and Wayne Gordon and John Perkins were part of a movement some 25, 30 years ago that has become the CCDA, the Christian Community Development Association. And Bob Lupton had been doing some incredible things and seeing transition happen in neighborhoods unlike anything that I'd ever seen before. So we started gathering people together, and we would drive down to Atlanta, and Bob would spend 3 or 4 days with us, and he would show us around the things that they were doing in mixed income housing. And they took us to the East Lakes project where they had built out the Bobby Jones golf course and had created a mixed income housing effort with a public golf course and all kinds of things that had gone on. It was one of the best examples of what could happen if folks got involved in true community development. And Bob was showing us the various plans. And you got to understand, the people that I was bringing down at this time, they were from churches. It was churches that I was working with that had an interest in how we might do missions a little bit differently. And I thought, wow, what a great example. We're going to go down and see what the church has done in Atlanta. And I'll never forget, probably the second or third trip, we're in a room, Bob is showing us all of the developments. And I said to Bob in front of this group of pastors and various other folks from the Kansas City area, how many churches were involved in what you were doing here? And he looked at me and he said, 0. And it took me back a second. I said, no, really, how many? He said, 0. Now that was 10 years ago. And he said, Tom, I've tried and tried and tried to work with the church, but they just don't get it. And the fact is their interest is in other areas. And quite frankly, what I have found is that we just need to move on with Christian businessmen and women who do get it, and then just create the space for the church to be able to be there somewhere down the road. And I remember thinking at the time, this ought not to be. I can understand why you might eventually come to the point of seeing that the church is really just overhead when it comes to the kind of stuff that they're doing. But I guess I hadn't been in the battle as long as Bob Lupton had been in the battle. And what he had found is that if he tried to pull the church into it, it became divisive, it became ineffective, inefficient, and they simply couldn't get to the end goal that they were trying to get to, which was to create a neighborhood where people would want to live and not leave. And I remember thinking to myself, there's got to be a way. There has got to be a way for the church to be involved in these kinds of things. Surely there is. And so since then, we've read the books. How many of you have read Fickert's book, When Helping Hurts? How many of you have read Bob Lupton's book, Toxic Charity? Yeah. So I'm in a crowd, and obviously you're here because those things speak to you. So Bob wrote his book, and he's talking about toxic charity, and Fickert wrote his book and talking about When Helping Hurts. And over the 10 years since that first conversation with Bob Lupton, I have noticed a significant change in the attitude of the church. Whereas 10 years ago, this conversation would come up, and almost invariably, the church would dig in its heels and say, we are not creating problems. We are not part of the problem. We just need to do what we've always done. We just need to do it more effectively and more efficiently. We need to do it better. And it was like you couldn't hardly get into a conversation about the idea that we might be able to do missions differently without there being this big uproar. Now fast forward 10 years to where we're at right now, and what I see happening in the church today is I rarely ever get pushback anymore from people saying, no, we're doing it fine. No, it's all okay. Almost every place I go and the groups that I talk to now in churches around the country are all saying, we get it. We get it. That a lot of the helping that we have done in the church and that philanthropy as a whole has done has created the kinds of dependencies that's not helping people and certainly not sustainable. We get it. And now here's what I'm hearing. I'm beginning to hear people say, I get it already. We get it. Enough. Our helping hurts. And what I'm beginning to hear is, so how do we move beyond helping that hurts? How do we move beyond the kinds of things that have been a problem in the past? And really, that's what all of this is about. That's what SAT Talks is about. That's what these next 2 days is about, is putting before you some ideas and some possibilities of where we might go beyond the helping that hurts. But why? Why should we even want to have the church involved in an effort like this? First of all, I'd say it's not out of sentimental reasons. I'm not a sentimentalist unless we're talking about the Cubs. In which case, I'm very sentimental about that, and I do believe this is the year. 108 years, this is the year. Now, I'll be sentimental all day long about the Cubs, but believe me, when I say that the church should be involved in this, it's not because I have this sentimental feeling about the church, that somehow, some way it deserves to be at the party, it deserves to be in this. That's not where I'm coming from. Even though my background is as a pastor, I'm not coming at this statement the church needs to be in it out of a theological construct. I don't believe that the church should be the hope of the world de facto, whether or not. I believe that the church has the opportunity to be the hope of the world in more of an if-then. If we will step up to certain things, if we will become the kind of mission-sending, the mission-working agency that I believe God wants us to be, then we can be not just the hope for hereafter, but also the hope for the here and now. I also believe that it's not just those kinds of reasons, but that we are an answer to what the world is asking right now out of a very serious practical if-then proposition that's shaped by a redefinition of sacrifice and stewardship. That if we will step into the space of what it means to help people break the cycle of poverty by creating the conditions by which people can flourish, the church has a role to play in missions unlike it's ever seen before. And I've shared this before, but I've begun to make the value proposition of the church, even to secular audiences, in this sort of way, that if I were an atheist, and I'm not, but if I were an atheist, I would want to work with the church, and here's why. Because first of all, the church is the largest donator of philanthropic dollars in the whole world. There's no organization in the world that gives more money to the cause of the marginalized than the church. And I've done this talk at the Federal Reserve and at the Kauffman Foundation in front of secular audiences at colleges, and nobody disagrees with me. They'll shake their heads, yeah, the church does donate a lot of dollars. But it's not just the money that the church donates. The church is the largest mobilizer of volunteer force in the world. Nobody gives more volunteer hours in the church. And every place I go, people understand that that's the truth. The church does do that. The third reason I'd want to work with the church, even if I weren't a Christian, the third reason I'd want to do it is because it's in our DNA. It's in our DNA to be the first in and the longest stay. Throughout the whole history of the church, we are people that go into the marginalized places and we work with people under difficult circumstances. We go first and we stay the longest. We have pastors preaching from pulpits all across this world, preaching on sermons like the Good Samaritan. Passages like, inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me. It's in our DNA to be there. And there's no way that we're going to be able to tackle some of these problems except we have the resolve to stay in that space. And fourth and finally, we have the greatest distribution network in the world. There's a church on every corner in virtually every country around the world. And nobody has done a better job at bringing relief and betterment to the world than the church. But we have found that we've come to the end of what relief and betterment can do for us. And that we have to somehow transition to the more complicated, complex efforts of true transformative development that's sustainable in all of its various kinds. What if, I've said to crowds, what if the church could become as good at delivering true development that's sustainable as we have at relief and betterment? Wouldn't you want to work with the church then? And I've not found anybody anywhere that said, no, I wouldn't. They've said, if you could mobilize the church to be involved in these kinds of intractable problems around the world, in those kinds of ways, we would welcome the opportunity to work with the church. And I believe that part of what goes on then in that whole effort is that we'll have to redefine what the gospel is. It's not just sharing with people what it means to be right with God after this life, but it's also the good news of what it means to live in this world and how to make accessible to those the same kind of things that are important to you and I in the culture that we live in. It's about not just the hereafter, but it's also about the here and now. It's also about the way in which we get to proclaim the gospel, and we get to proclaim it as we're going. And as people look at what we do and the sacrifices that we make to pull them into realities that they've not been able to have up to this point, and they ask us, why do you do this? And then you and I get to then give an answer to the hope that we have in Christ and why it is that we do what we do comes out of that kind of a faith statement. And so we start to move beyond the kinds of helping that hurts. We have to, if we're going to move beyond helping that hurts, we also have to move beyond our feelings and the sense of the unintended consequences. Another thing that I find is that I have various talks with audiences is that as I begin to describe the tension that's going on in church missions, I'll ask them this question, and I want to ask you the question. I want you to write something down, and I want to talk about it maybe later on in the conference. But I ask people to do this. After we've talked about the difficulties that are going on, how do you feel about the complexity and the need to move on? Do you feel guilty? Do you feel overwhelmed? Or do you feel determined? I'm finding that most people feel one of those three things. They're feeling this tremendous guilt, like, oh, we've done it wrong for so long and we're never going to be able to recover, and I've been a part of the problem. And I just want to say to you, you've not been a part of the problem in any kind of an unnecessary way. I'm convinced that we couldn't get to today and the kinds of conversations that we're having except that we went through the kind of stuff that led us to helping that hurts. I think it's part of the evolutionary process of what it means to be humans and to grow and to progress. There was a time when charity was the only option for us dealing with people in the context of poverty, but that's not the only option anymore. And so for us to sit around and feel guilty because we've been a part of the helping that hurts is to miss the point. We stand at a crossroads where the opportunity is great. And for us to sit around beating ourselves because we've been a part of what got us here is to miss the point. I've also found that other people just feel overwhelmed. They just kind of throw their hands up and say, this is too complicated, I can't do it. Give me another food pantry and a clothes closet and a soup kitchen. Now, if that's what you're doing, we're here to challenge you that there might be more that you could do even than those things right there. And yes, it will be overwhelming, but I believe that God has put within the church the people that can help lead us out of the kinds of stuff that we're doing. But the third option that I find some people are at this sense of determined, that they've become determined. There is a better way to do this, and we're going to do it in a different sort of way. And I suspect that many of you in this audience today represent those who are determined. You've wrestled with, you've read the books, and you want to be a part of a different way of helping people in the context of poverty. And that, yeah, you may feel a little bit overwhelmed, and you might feel a little bit guilty because of some things that you've done, but it's all part of our learning curve. My guess is that you have a sense of determination that I can be a part of doing something different. And that's really what SAT Talks is about. How do we gather those people together? How do we gather those stories and begin to tell them more and begin to invite more people into the conversation and to begin to move this whole idea of what we could do in a development model further down the road? I think the other thing that we have to move beyond then, if we're going to get beyond just the helping that hurts, is what I call beyond Band-Aids, bandwagons, and beauty pageants. So please hear me. We're gonna put up in front of you 7 or 8 speakers today. The last thing I want you to think is that this is some kind of a beauty pageant of not-for-profits and NGOs around the country to somehow show them off in hopes that more funding will come to them. That's not the point. This isn't comparing any of those ministries to any other ministries that are up here. Instead, it's about us bringing people up here who can tell the stories and who will readily admit that they're in the process of learning as well. It's humbly admitting that we don't have this thing figured out. It's not a beauty pageant. I hope that you will enter into the conversation with these speakers if you'll begin to look and see the model and the principles behind what they're doing, because I believe that there's smart enough people in this room and churches all across the world who can take the transferable principles and the things that are working in other ministries and begin to put them into ministries and into contexts and places and locales that matter to you. It's not about everybody getting on the bandwagon, if you will, with Hope International or Life in Abundance or the Rainbow Network or any of the other ministries here. Will you listen? Will you listen to the stories? It's not about a bandwagon. One of the things I'm finding that's happening is that the church, like almost any other organization, can be a bandwagon organization. It hears the latest thing going on, and the next thing you know, we're dressing up our old stuff in new language. And at the end of the day, it's just the old stuff dressed up in new language of development and transformation and things like that. That's not what this is about. How do we get deep into our models and really see whether or not they do lead to transformation and sustainability? What are the things that we've not yet figured out that need to be figured out? It's also bringing us to the end of a bifurcated faith. A faith that somehow has believed that there is a line between secular and sacred. That somehow those of us that were called into full-time Christian service are in the sacred work and everybody else is in secular work. You're going to hear from a couple of speakers today that have totally obliterated that sense of understanding, that there is no line. And we've come to the limit of that understanding, because when we see that sort of thing, then really we are left to do only what we can do in terms of missions through the clergy, because they are the top of the pyramid. But what if every vocation were a calling under the lordship of Christ? What if some of you have the gift of making money, the gift of deal making? What if that is just as important as the gift of pastoral care and those sort of things? I believe that God has given us all different gifts, and the church has come to the end, and none too soon, of somehow thinking that they're secular and they're sacred. I'm running into more and more millennials these days who have totally obliterated that line. They see walking into work on Monday mornings as sacred an experience as walking into church on Sunday. They see that the people that they deal with on a daily basis are just as precious and sacred as the people they deal with in church or in small group. Can you see where that begins to get us as a culture? It's no longer a secular and a sacred. But I think the other thing that we're coming to is this bifurcated idea of the gospel, that somehow the gospel is all about the hereafter. And if you think about it deeply, it was only because of that bifurcated understanding of the faith that allowed dominant societies and dominant cultures to enslave others. How else can you explain what cultures have done in enslaving people and at the same time teaching them Christianity? And if you talk to anybody who has any understanding of the colonial spirit behind all of that, it was that those in the dominant culture would be able to live in this life, in the here and now, with all of the luxury and all of the privilege that comes with it. And we were able to pacify the fact that those that we were enslaving weren't, by simply saying to them, but you'll get yours in the sweet by and by. But when we totally obliterate the notion that there is no difference between the here and now and the here and now and the hereafter in God's eyes in terms of what it means to treat people a certain way, then all of a sudden it becomes just as important for us to help people in the here and now as it does to teach them about what it means to be right with God and get to the place that we all long for in the hereafter. Can you see how at that point our faith has taken a giant step forward? We're moving beyond the kinds of things that lead to helping that hurts. If the church would move beyond, let me show you a picture. I was impressed by this news flash. Did you see that a while back? So Mark Zuckerberg is going to donate, and he and his wife are going to donate at least $3 billion over the next 10 years. They're going to donate $3 billion over the next 10 years to do what? To cure, I love it, to cure all diseases. Now, how about a few? How about 50%? 25%? But I can guarantee you that there's a man with a vision that if he believes that if he were to resource it financially, if he were to find the subject matter expertise and the resolve, that he could end disease in his lifetime. And it just makes me wonder, what would happen if the church made that kind of a resolve? What would happen if we said we're willing to put money, we're willing to mobilize expertise, and we're willing to be resolved to help people in the context of poverty, to create sustainable solutions where people can survive on their own? Would we have the faith in the God that we claim to worship to make a statement like that and then to back it up with our money, our expertise, and our resolve? I have no doubt that the energies and efforts he puts towards that goal in the next 10 years will be to accomplish it, not just to talk about it, not just to have a parade, but whether or not he can do it, I don't know. I don't have any idea whether he can do it. But I'm struck by the fact that we, people of faith, in a God that can move mountains and do miracles, do we have a willingness on our part to dedicate the money? Because as we look at sustainable solutions, it's going to require us to put funding towards things that we haven't typically put them towards. It's going to cause us to risk some funds that we're not likely to risk at this point. It's going to cause us to have to fail at some certain things. It's going to cause us to have to channel some money that's going towards things that create dependencies to things that might not create dependencies. Do we have a willingness to mobilize the dollars in that way? And then pastors especially, are we willing to create the space and invite into that space businessmen and women with expertise who can help us solve some of these problems, who can help us create the kinds of jobs, that can help us create the kinds of projects that can lead to self-sustaining solutions? Will we have the courage, pastors, to let others do what they do incredibly well and we have no idea how they do it or how to do it? Will we let them do it through the mission work of our church? And then finally, will we have the resolve? I think one of the most frustrating things that I have found in the last 10 years as well is that as baby boomers have retired more and more, healthier and wealthier than at any other time, there has been this great wave of men and women my age who have come out of the marketplace with incredibly successful lives. And they have thought that they could move from success to significance, that they could take the business practices and various things that they've learned on Wall Street and take them and just kind of somehow superimpose them over the people that live in the context of poverty. And I have found over and over and over again, many of us baby boomers who have done that have come out of the workplace, out of a successful career, gotten involved in not-for-profit ministries, and when we couldn't see the change as fast as we wanted to, or the people didn't have the tools, we got bored and burned out and we went on to something else, making it even more difficult for those that you're going to hear in the next 2 days to do the long-term work of what they're doing. Are we willing not only to put the money towards it, to find the subject matter expertise that'll help us? Are we committed for the long haul? And I believe that if we find the money, the expertise, and the resolve, I believe that we'll find the fulfillment of that great benediction that we say oftentimes in our church. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. My prayer for our time together here and for what's going on in church mission as a whole is that God would raise up more and more men and women, more and more churches willing to put their money where their mouth is, make room for those with expertise and with a dogged determination and a resolve that somehow, some way, we're going to find a way to help create the conditions for human flourishing so that people can lift themselves out of poverty and no longer be dependent upon the things that we bring and serve them.